Steve and Jess, I'm so glad you could join me today. This is going to be a really important conversation. So thank you for being a part of it.
Thank you
Of
for
course.
asking, Karen.
Steve, let's start with your interview that you did with Cleveland's Crane Cleveland's newspaper
Yeah,
that talked about Notre Dame, John Carroll, and Lake Erie College.
sure.
Give us a landscape of that.
Yeah. So first and foremost, Notre Dame College, which is just outside of the Cleveland area, or just in the Cleveland area, rather. Notre Dame College closed at the end of last academic year. Lake Erie College, which is just outside of Cleveland, has been struggling a little bit financially. Its percent of its student body that are athletes is extremely high. And then he also interviewed John Carroll University. And full disclosure, I worked at a rival of John Carroll. I spent 2 years at Baldwin Wallace University in the Cleveland area as a dean there, and know JCU very well. They're big rivals, and JCU's trying to balance that. They're making some other interesting moves, switching conferences, leaving the Ohio Athletic Conference in a year to go to the North Coast Athletic Conference that arguably aligns them a little bit better with similar types of institutions on an academic and athletic scale. Um, but Notre Dame College had about 65% of its student body were athletes. It's a Division II school. Lake Erie College, also Division II. They're up closer to the 80% mark. And the gist of the interview that Joe Scalzo did with their president was that they're working to reduce that. They recognize that there is a inherent problem when the majority of students on a campus, particularly a Division II school where you are issuing athletic grants and aids, when that percentage gets too high and the overall impact it has on the finances of the campus.
So to kind of bring it around to the other part of this, Jesse, you just did a piece on Mount St. Mary's, which is in Western Maryland, just adding women's flag football with a part of logic that I had not heard before. So talk to us a little bit about that particular article and what drew you to that.
Yeah, this is almost just going to hit the bingo card of sort of modern college athletics speak. Because there's a lot going on here. Mount St. Mary's is, like you said, a small Division I school in Maryland, and what it's hoping to do in the next few years, should the House settlement be approved. I know, Karen, you've talked about the House settlement a lot on your podcast before. It wants to revenue share with athletes. Doesn't want to revenue share with all its athletes at first. What it really wants to do is pay some amount of money to men's and women's basketball players. Now, what that's going to do to its athletic department is if you opt into this revenue sharing model as it's written into the proposed settlement, you're now subject to new roster limits. So what it will do is actually bring down the number of track and field athletes you're allowed to have, lacrosse players, etc. Now, Mount St. Mary's, as this relates to Steve's research, is a school that relies heavily on its athletes to keep its enrollment up. It's 2,000 students, or about. Its athletic director told me that right now that's 42% athletes. So when they talked about revenue sharing with basketball players, trying to compete more in the MAC, their small, low major conference, they said, we can't really take this enrollment hit. We can't have these roster limits take away our track and field spots, our cross country spots, our lacrosse spots, whatever it may be. So we need a way to sort of bridge this gap to add some athletes. And like you said, Karen, it's sort of counterintuitive right now because we're hearing a lot of D1 schools talk about subtracting athletes, right? And trying to sort of manage costs that way. The AD, Brad Davis, told me that when he goes to his president and says, I want to revenue share with basketball players, we want to be more competitive in the MAC, but we're going to lose 45, 50, 60 athletes, that's not possible. This is a really delicate balance for this school that really needs to keep those enrollment numbers up. So they're adding women's flag football, hoping in spring of 2025, which could be maybe 25, 30 athletes at its peak. And these sound like really small numbers, but those aren't going to be full scholarship athletes. They're going to recruit players from their area. They're going to hope they're paying tuition, in some cases full tuition, maybe down the line that they're getting maybe quarter 1A scholarships, whatever it may be. But it's walking a really delicate line financially as athletics relate to enrollment. And I'm curious to hear what Steve thinks about it because it's a really interesting case to me, and it feels like it checks a lot of boxes for what's going on in college sports right now.
Yeah, and Jesse, to your point, I did some looking at. So I get most of my figures, most of my data from the Equity in Athletics Data Analysis website. It's a government website. every athletic department is mandated to report certain numbers, including enrollment, participation data, revenues, expenses. Details are not great in it, but it does give you some baseline, and it provides at least a level for us to make comparisons in academia. And so one of the things I did is I looked at the reporting year, survey year of 2019. So this has been 2019, 2020. So the year that COVID hit. And I've started to kind of look at, well, where was an institution at with its enrollment? Where is it at with its athletic participation? And what I found for Mount St. Mary's specifically, and I mean no ill will on Mount St. Mary's, as we were talking beforehand, my son looked at going to school there. I've been on its campus. It's a lovely little campus, nestled in the mountains there on the border with Pennsylvania. They are up 7 students between 2019 and survey year 2022. That's 7 undergraduate students. That's good. But they're up 58 athletes. So their athletic participation rate has exceeded the overall student body growth rate, is what that is telling us. And there are a number of schools, particularly at the Division III level, that really fit kind of that mold of numbers. Maybe enrollment looks good because the numbers are up, but now to your point, you're bringing in these athletes, and yes, they need to pay tuition because now you've got additional costs associated with, we have to hire a women's flag football coach. We may have to have an additional athletic trainer. We got to find locker room space for them. We've got to, outfit them, do all of these things. There's expenses that go along with that. So the athletes coming in, the hope is that some of their tuition dollars is going to offset those costs. But that doesn't change the campus proper. You still got faculty, you still got administrators, staff, the cafeteria workers, everybody else that needs to be paid on a college campus. And so if you're taking money from that student athlete, applying it to their sport, there's less money then that you can use to run the regular operation.
Jesse, my question to you is reading that, it sounds like the president gave the AD a directive that this is how we're going to grow our enrollment. Did the AD have any concerns as, like Steve expressed, I'm going to need additional staff, I'm going to need additional travel money? Did he express any of that when you interviewed him?
Yeah, he did. And I think the counterpoint, or the way maybe to mitigate that, is the sport they're adding, they feel it could be very low cost. Now, that's not no cost, right? There's going to be, you can't, like Steve said, you have to add some staff. You have to have some, there's going to be some travel. There's going to have to be space to work out. There has to be equipment, uniforms, etc. But not joining a conference right away, or joining as a full participation D1 championship sport is a different financial commitment than trying to add maybe, a football team, of course, would be a major expense, right. But even a softball team, if they didn't have one, or something of that sort, this is something where they see a 2 to 3 person staff. They do foresee adding maybe an athletic trainer. But they do feel that in years 1, 2, and 3, if there's no conference affiliate, there's only one other announced D1 program, they can cobble together bus trips to nearby D2 schools, club teams, D3 schools. It's a little bit like building the plane. It's not a little bit. It's a lot like building the plane while you're flying. So I think within that, you can probably try to stay within specific financial restraints. Now, do the margins work out that added tuition money can actually feed back to the campus? I'd be really curious to know, in 2 or 3 years, based on the numbers, if that actually works. But I would say that the concerns they have probably match that the sport they're adding is not something that's going to take a major upfront financial commitment. But there, of course, still is some.
Yeah, Jesse, I mean, your point's well taken. It's a low cost sport because there's not a lot of equipment, and you've got a field that you can use because you've got soccer teams and you've got lacrosse teams at Mount St. Mary's. So I get that. One of the things that you've said, which was a point that I wanted to bring up, is they're on the tip of this at the Division I level because there is only one other Division I team. There are I've been tracking the number of sports added and dropped since COVID began on a Google sheet that I make available. And there are 9 Division III women's flag football teams. So one of the challenges, I think, for Mount St. Mary's or anybody else that's kind of on the beginning edge of a wave, and we saw this with women's wrestling. Women's wrestling has exploded to the point where there's 40, 50 Division III programs, But really at the Division I level, there's still just Iowa and maybe one or two others. But at what point in time, as you're recruiting women's flag football players, you have to be able to sell it's a better experience coming to the Mount than it is going to one of these Division III schools.
Right.
And so there has to be that connection to the campus. It can't just be solely an athletic play.
The other question I was thinking about too is that Mount St. Mary's does not have football. So they don't have the Title IX challenges that so many of these other schools do. So obviously they're putting a great emphasis on basketball. Do they feel like how do they get to the point of revenue sharing with athletes by adding women's flag football? Explain that to the audience.
It's a great question. A major facet of the House settlement is that it actually doesn't require any minimum revenue sharing. So, I mean, I say this in a joking manner, but you could technically split $1 across your basketball roster, right? You can cut it up with a scissor. I mean, no one's going to do that. But I think the revenue sharing piece is not necessarily we're going to have a $2 million payroll like you might see at a mid-major or low high major basketball program. It's more we're going to advertise ourselves as a place where athletes could potentially make money directly from their school through their NIL rights. Could that be we're going to turn our collective into an MMR company and try to do it that way? Do we have a commitment from a donor? Can we set up a photo shoot with the local car dealer who's a season ticket holder? So this is not revenue sharing like you're going to see it at Duke and Kentucky and Purdue, whatever it may be. I think it's actually more so about perception. We're the team in the MAC that is going to revenue share. We're saying we're going to be in this upper echelon. The NCAA through this settlement is in some ways splitting college sports into Division I college sports into two buckets, right? You're a revenue sharing team or you're not. Now, if the athletes in the MAC that are maybe being recruited by other schools and they say Mount St. Mary's, they revenue share. This one over here, they don't. I'm hearing that if they add 2 more bye games next year and we go get ourselves, crushed on the road at Michigan State, they might actually divvy some of that money up to us. Like there are ways in which the school can do it on a rolling year basis. I don't foresee it being like, here's a 3-year contract like you might see over at, Michigan or Michigan State, whatever it may be.
Sure.
So it's going to be a different brand of revenue sharing, but I do believe it's actually, and I'm not saying this is necessarily prudent, but what I've heard is that it's more about perception maybe than it is actually about the dollars and cents they're going to be offering right away.
Right. Steve, on your blog, you referenced earlier that a number of schools have closed. Ohio has had some. New York has had some. We're starting to see some real areas of concern in Pennsylvania. In fact, this morning's Philadelphia Inquirer has an extensive piece on the financial instability of so many of our small colleges in eastern Pennsylvania. So where are you with terms of percentages, in terms of what trends you've seen and how these schools are managing this?
Yeah, and this is, I'm not privy to any sort of on-campus conversations, right? I'm looking at these publicly available data figures. I mean, anybody can go find this stuff. It's available. I coined the term, for better or worse, 44 percenters as, this threshold that at that point in time when 44% of a campus's student body are also athletes, there is a greater relationship with potential for closing. And if you look at schools that closed in the past year, this is Birmingham Southern College. It is, the Cazenovia a couple years ago, Medale, a couple years ago, places like that, Finlandia, they all exceeded 44%. The only one that didn't was a Division II school, College of St. Rose, and they were at about 27%. But as you progress from Division III upward to Division II to Division I, we find that there are fewer schools that meet that 44 percentile. So at the Division I level, the only 2 schools that I found based on crunching that data for the last survey year, the 22 survey year, was Presbyterian College in South Carolina and Queen's University of Charlotte. Presbyterian was over 50%. They only have 863 total students. They're a Division I school that plays FCS football. And it's 863. They're the smallest in enrollment wise, I believe, in Division One. Queens is one that just recently transitioned from Division Two up to Division One, and they were at just over 44%. So you see only two there. At the Division Three level, though, I found somewhere like 60 schools, I think was what my number was. I want to confirm my data here, but something like that were in that 44 percentile range. And there, that's a problem. As you look at this, when you start looking at the overall makeup, as we've talked about on the campus and where the expenses lie. And I'll give you another little anecdote of one that's kind of similar to Mount St. Mary's and kind of in that same geographic region. So Karen, to your point, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, kind of that Rust Belt stuff that goes around Lake Erie and north and things. Bethany College in West Virginia is another one that is an interesting. So right now they sit at about 75% of their student body as athletes. I did the same thing that I did with Mount St. Mary's, as I referenced earlier. I looked at 2019 survey year data, compared that with this previous survey year, and they're up 92 overall students, but they're up 118 athletes. So again, the overall non-athlete population on their campus is shrinking. And the universities like that are still adding sports. And so it does raise the question of how does that work on a college campus from a dynamic standpoint, where you have a lot of athletes and a lot of non-athletes, and what is that doing to the culture on the campus?
And I know last year or the year before, the new college in Florida underwent a philosophical shift, so shall we call it, where one of the things that the school decided to do was add a bunch of sports to try to change the culture of the student body. And so that's one of the few examples that I've seen where colleges are purposely trying to change the culture. But what you're saying, Steve, is some of these schools may be adding to the culture that they have, which we don't know. Does it add to the strength of the college? Does it further diminish the experience of the non-student athletes on campus? Any thoughts on that, Steve?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I'll say this about New College of Florida. They're NAIA, and I did not, for the purposes of my latest article on Substack, I did not look at NAIA schools. NAIA schools, my hypothesis is that they are all going to be 50%, or at least majority of them will be 50% or higher athletes. That's just part of the NAIA culture, is that there are a lot of athletes on those campuses. And so to your point, I think that's a decision that New College has made, that this is where we want to be and how we want to position our campus.
Sure. So, Jesse, Ohio State's president just announced that he is committed to keeping all 36 sports fully scholarship, fully functional, with the expectation that they will win conference and national championships. He clearly sees them as a leader in this space. With roster caps looming, explain to the audience what that means and the traffic jam that it could mean for athletes being boxed out of D1 roster spots, but also about athletes who want to move up from 2 to 1 or even 3 to 1.
Yeah, so what the House settlement would do, and again, we can't hammer enough that it's still theoretical.
Right.
It seems like it's moving in that direction, but approval would come in April from a judge if it does. And what it would do is it would remove scholarship limits from Division I sports for teams that opt into this revenue share, but it would establish roster caps. So what you're now saying is, if you have a roster of 10 players, you could in theory have them all on full scholarship if you like, but you maybe in the past could have 15. So now there's 5 fewer spots. There's just more scholarships to go around. So when you talk about the crunch or the musical chairs game, there's sports out there that typically have had really, really high numbers. Sometimes in some cases to help with the Title IX equation, Karen, that you mentioned earlier with football.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think women's rowing, track and field. There's some really bloated lacrosse rosters out there. Even football, I mean, you've seen 120, 125, 130 in some cases with walk-ons. And that's actually a way to sort of, help with enrollment. And those athletes are paying full tuition. And so the crunch is that, there's going to be fewer spots. I mean, it's just, that's the reality. And maybe, there's going to be there's going to be more opportunity to get scholarship money That's, that is a possibility. But for athletes that maybe were hanging on to the end of rosters, or like you said, looking to make a jump from a different level, there's still going to be schools that are not subject to those caps because they're not going to be in the revenue sharing model. So that doesn't all go away, but it certainly makes it harder, and it certainly is going to be a really tough. I'm sure there's already coaches now having to call recruits from, high school juniors, high school seniors, and say, we don't know if we're going to have these spots, in the future, or transfers, whatever it may be. So it's changing the math. I mean, and it's happening, somewhat overnight in a lot of cases. So.
Yeah, Jesse, I think,
go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, Karen. I think that's something that I really am curious to see how this impacts the Division II and the Division IIIs, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, the sport at the NCAA level that I'm most familiar with is men's lacrosse. And, they've moved to a cap of 48, which that's about 12 people on average on the big Division I rosters that are no longer going to have a place.
Right.
Yep.
Now, could some of those, say if Penn State, has to cut down to 48, or Ohio State, could some of those find their way to Mount St. Mary's, which does have a Division I men's lacrosse? Sure, that possibility exists. And maybe Mount St. Mary's goes from 42 to 48. But there's a big difference in competition level between being on Ohio State or Penn State or at Cornell or, any of the blue bloods that are in men's lacrosse, and being on Mount St. Mary's and some of these others at the Division I level that maybe compete for a conference championship, but certainly are not going to make an impact on the national stage. Or do those athletes then seek a different opportunity to play at a highly competitive Division III or a Division II type of program? And what is the trickle down effect there? Because there are no roster caps in Division III.
Mm-hmm.
150 people on a football roster at the Division III level is not uncommon.
Yeah.
And at some point in time, and Karen, this gets back to, I know your audience for this is really kind of trustees and presidents, right?
Yeah.
To me, the biggest concern about bloated rosters like that is the retention of those students. When you are the last person on the depth chart and a coach has said, yeah, come here, I want you to come on our team, you'll have a chance to compete for a spot, and you realize that that's not going to occur, the retention of that student now falls to the campus, falls to the faculty. And the reason that student was there was to play a sport, perhaps not to, the academics might have been a secondary reason they chose that. But the burden of retaining that student, which is so important for all of these campuses to have consistent enrollment, to manage budgets, that's a problem, or I think it could be a problem.
Yeah, those are really good points. Steve, I'm just curious, that you have a deep insight into men's lacrosse. If you take a school like Salisbury, which has been historically very strong in men's lacrosse,
Yeah.
could they benefit even more by attracting some high-level D1 type players that are left out of the mix? And they say, well, heck, there's no roster limit at Salisbury. I'll go there. They keep winning national championships.
Yeah, I think that's a real possibility, Karen.
Yeah.
I think what you see some of the Division III schools that are more state type schools, so Salisbury, Christopher Newport, that are very strong in Division III lacrosse, and then you get the NESCAC type schools, the Tufts and the Amherst and the Bowdens and those types of things. They could benefit from roster caps in the Ivy League if that were to occur. There's a natural overlap between the Ivies and the NESCACs.
Yes.
But Salisbury and Christopher Newport, I mean, we've seen athletes go from Salisbury up to the Division I level and be successful.
Yes.
And there's no reason to think that. So I think that margin really comes down to what is the preferred campus for that athlete, because the skill level plays at either place.
So another school I want to talk to you all about, because in various points we've had conversations or you've written about it, is the University of Hartford. And they moved a couple of years ago from Division I and Division III, much to the consternation of their former men's basketball coach, who had just made March Madness. He was very excited, and the school, he felt, pulled the rug out from underneath him. So there was much angst over that, much transition. They now have a new president who, full disclosure, is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine through the Penn program. And he comes with a Division III background. He comes from Babson, so he understands that mindset. But Is this something that you think, Jesse, let's start with you. Can we see more schools trending in this direction of perhaps doing what some people have called the unthinkable and leaving Division One?
Yeah, I'm going to use the answer time here to ask Steve a question because that's something I've been curious about this whole conversation, and that's I've never been in a room that had to strategically plan for enrollment, right? That's my blind spot here among many others. But what I'm curious is thinking about the D1 versus D3 equation. How much are you considering the experience of non-athlete students? And I'm asking maybe a perception question, maybe something that can't be measured,
Yeah.
but you think, well, I'm at Hartford. There's not much of a chance for this team to make a run. But remember when George Mason made that run in 2006? Wouldn't it be cool to go watch a tournament game? You can always win your conference. And I'm not saying those things are maybe worth a whole college tuition, but for a 18-year-old sports fan, it might feel different to go to those games than a Division III game, whether or not the competition is that much different. So I'm curious how much sort of that non-athlete student psyche and the sort of fandom maybe does play into those decisions. And if you ever could actually measure any sort of that effect at all.
Those are really good questions, Jesse. And what I would say initially to that is that you asked about the enrollment difference for a Division One and a Division Three. Mount St. Mary's on its face doesn't look much different than a Division III school.
Right.
The average Division III school enrolls, just over 2,000 or so undergraduates. Mount St. Mary's comes in below that. They're in a more rural setting, which is what you typically associate with, I think, with more Division III and Division II type of schools. But yeah, there is that perception that I'm D1. And if you're an athlete, there is a perception about going to a D1 school. I'm a D1 athlete. And the question to that high school athlete becomes, what do you want your D1 experience? What do you want your college athletic experience to be? Do you want to be a D1 athlete that maybe can pull, you cited George Mason, I'll go to St. Peter's, something like that puts together this fabulous Elite Eight run and captivates the country. But those happen, once every 15 years, it seems like. So do you want to roll your dice that that's what's going to happen? Or do you want to go to a different experience where you're going to regularly compete for a conference championship and get a chance to play in the NCAA tournament in whatever sport it is, whether it's basketball, lacrosse, whatever it is? Do you want that as a part of your legacy as an athlete? The student body experience, I think it just varies. I think the more that there are, the higher percentage of athletes that you have, obviously that just becomes the culture of the campus. And so, yeah, you might see the women's soccer team show out to support the women's volleyball team at a match or something like that, just because that's the culture that exists on a smaller. I haven't been to a game at Mount St. Mary's. I don't know if that's what occurs there. And I don't know if it's what it occurs at Hartford. I don't know if, the regular student body, because Hartford they're not close to being 44%. They weren't when they made that decision.
Right.
So I don't, you ask a question that you ask about measuring it. Yeah. For those of us in academia, that'd be a great thing for us to figure out how to study and measure.
The algorithm, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, but Hartford's interesting because, it's in a big city and, I did crunch some numbers about Hartford, and they are down about 600 students, but they have this relatively the same number of athletes, but they've lowered their athletic expense by about $7 million since that transition period. So you're providing the same type of experience, or you're providing an experience for the same number of students, doing it at a lower cost to the institution. And that's, I think that's a bold decision that they made. And, I commend them for doing that, recognizing that it wasn't potentially sustainable for them to continue at that Division I level.
And I would add, Steve, too, I think their geographic location may have played a role. There's so many small Division III schools that it may have shortened their travel time.
Oh, agreed.
In that area. So in some ways, it allowed them to be a differentiator, but also to reduce costs. And I think that $7 million savings in scholarship money was substantial for them.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. So, final words of wisdom. I can imagine trustees and presidents are wrestling with this right now. The prestige of Division One, the relative simpleness of just adding more teams equates to more students. I personally believe that might have worked 10 years ago, but I'm not sure that works in every part of the country today. What are your takeaways that you want trustees and presidents to think about from your reporting and your research? Jesse, why don't you start?
Read Steve's Substack, Glory Days. I'm already going to start.
Thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate that.
No, I would say that I'm still sort of stuck on thinking about lower end D1 schools moving to D3 is not something I considered much, and I'm still stuck on if you could ever figure out if the enrollment benefit, not just with athletes but with all students, actually equates or outweighs the cost it takes to fund scholarships, to fund Division I sports, to fund the travel that comes with it. If you can figure out that equation,
facilities too. I mean, some of these facilities that are being built are just incredible,
and the overhead it takes to maintain them.
Correct.
If you could ever figure that out, I'd be fascinated. And I'm more so just giving myself homework to think more about this and to ask more administrators about these things. But my thought is that at Mount St. Mary's specifically, we're dealing with fairly small numbers. So I don't know if it's a representative case rather than it's a wonky, one-off. Could it work? I'm not sure, but you're dealing with sort of trying to replace 40 students with 25 spots. And it's maybe a little bit of I'm going to use a football term, Hail Mary, to actually balance the budget that way. But it doesn't necessarily feel like it's representative. I think sometimes I write stories and report them, and I hope that they can apply to a bunch of different schools. And sometimes you reply ones that are just like that's an interesting sort of specific case that maybe that could sort of be a creative solution for a certain amount of time, but it might not actually be something that could work across them.
Steve, what do you think?
I mean, adding sports is not inherently bad. I mean, I'm a sports fan. We all love sports. I mean, they're great. It's a wonderful part of the college experience, and there are many high school athletes who are not ready to let go of that athlete identity and still want to play at the collegiate level, want to be able to participate in a team environment. So adding those things is not inherently bad. I think, to me, it's adding it in a way that is sustainable and that makes sense. We see schools adding stunt and women's acrobatics and tumbling. What is really the difference between those two types of sports? And you find that a lot of schools in the same geographic area add those things. Is there really enough of an audience? Is there really enough of a pipeline for those? Women's wrestling is another one, and I love wrestling, and I'm so excited that it's growing as rapidly as it has at the NCAA level. But I don't know enough about the high school participation numbers to know, can you fill a roster? Can you get enough people to do that? But again, that's another low cost sport. If you've already got men's wrestling, you can probably fold it in. I wrote back when I was writing for Athletic Director U, I wrote about Ursinus College, which is right there by you, Karen. And they folded it in under their men's program and had the men's coach serve as the director of the women's thing. And they were one of the early adopters of that. And it's worked out for Ursinus. But so being intentional and being thoughtful about those things, and not just kind of, women's flag football, I do think it's going to take off. I think it makes a lot of sense. And Mount St. Mary's is on the tip of that wave going upward. They're going to have to figure out how to navigate through that. But I think if they are successful, you will see other schools in their conference, the MAC and other geographic things, trying to add that sport.
Yeah. And you mentioned Presbyterian College. I interviewed their former president for a podcast a couple of years ago, asking how they could survive in Division I, 863 students. Mm-hmm. And part of it goes back to decisions that were made 20 plus years ago by a different board in a different time. And it's really hard to say to people, we've changed, the marketplace has changed, and maybe we need to do something different. I think presidents struggle with that because they don't want to do anything that people would perceive diminishes the status of their campus. Mm-hmm. And the division that you're in plays a role in that. So adding, dropping sports, growing squads, shrinking squads, all very top of mind. I thank you both for being here. This has been a tremendous conversation. I look forward to continued dialogue with you both.
Thanks so much, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. Appreciate it, Jesse. Thank you.